These early post-Krypton scenes really are the best parts of the movie, but even so, by themselves, they aren't really enough to give us a fully fleshed out Clark. It's that Nolan-esque tone we talked about that's always getting in the way. For example, there's a lot of subtlety going on in the mind of a young person kind of finding themselves, and that kind of thing is part of what would make the character relatable to us, for sure, but what we really needed here were non-serious, lighthearted, and fun moments. Moments that show us that Clark is actually a three-dimensional character with hopes and dreams just like everyone else. Without it, Man of Steel's Clark kind of comes across as very sterile and detached. Plus, all of these scenes are presented to us as flashbacks from older Clark's perspective, right? That means he's not remembering any happy times from his childhood, and isn't that kind of a bad sign? I understand that the point here is that Clark is distant because he feels like he's an outsider. I get it, but I'm arguing that this was the wrong take. What we need is a solid spiritual foundation because this is a character that eventually becomes the living embodiment of hope. Scenes like this one with Jonathan Kent accepting Clark as his son are very warm and intimate moments, but it's largely the exception instead of the rule. Most of what we get are these cold, stoic talks about Clark doing what he's told. But Clark's not just Superman, and he's not just about duty and justice. He's also about being inspiring and uplifting, and that takes a certain kind of tone and a certain kind of character. Here's an argument I make a lot, that one of the keys to making any Superman work, regardless of if it's an origin story or not, is the idea that although he's fictional, Superman is in concept an inspirational figure. A spiritual leader, similar to real-life people like Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. And just like many of those real-life heroes, there's the sort of inspiring public symbol, and then there's the actual man. There's Superman the symbol, and Clark Kent the man, right? See, Superman could just fly around as Superman all the time, never having to eat, sleep, get a job, or any of that. And wouldn't you use that kind of power for that kind of freedom and fun? Well, Clark wouldn't, because being Clark, living as a human, keeps him connected to humanity. Clark keeps Superman humble and down to earth, allowing him to empathize with the very people he's trying to save. This, essentially, is what makes Superman special. He's a hero and a symbol, but he's really just a nice guy trying to do what's right. He's not some avenging vigilante or a smart-ass rogue, he's just the guy who genuinely cares enough to try. This is in stark contrast to a character like Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen, whose incredible power alienates him from humanity, causing him to detach from society and grow cold. That's the point of the character, that he's a deconstruction of Superman. See, I think Man of Steel shows us the things Clark does and the things that happen to him, but it rarely ever shows us who he is. Because of this, his motivations are often vague and weird to us. It's really hard to say what's actually going on in his head because he's kind of like a statue. The movie never shows or tells us, we're just left making assumptions. Which is what a lot of people do when arguing in favor of Man of Steel. They convince themselves of something that the movie never actually explains. These are also called excuses. So, in case you're someone who hasn't heard this before, it's not the audience's job to make excuses for a movie. It's the writer and director's job to make a better movie. I think Snyder was being a hypocrite, just like they were with the trailers. I think he said to himself, everyone already knows Superman's a nice guy, so I don't really have to emphasize this. But that obviously raises a lot of problems. It just results in your version not having enough characterization of its own. You can't say you're making a new Superman and rely on the previous ones. You can't have it both ways. Snyder himself addressed criticism, saying it was an inexperienced Superman who made mistakes in Man of Steel, and he'd have to deal with the consequences of those mistakes in the sequel. But was that always planned, or is it just a reaction to the negative response people had to Man of Steel? I think the answer is pretty obvious. DC and Snyder realized they'd made a mistake, so all of that talk is just damage control. I don't really buy a word of it. Movie trilogies, outside of material based on novels like Lord of the Rings, don't actually plan ahead. This was especially true with the Dark Knight trilogy. Each movie was intended to be the last one because Nolan didn't want to keep coming back for sequels. Marvel is actually pretty unique with the shared universe concept, where they have movies and basic storylines planned out well ahead of time. People other than Snyder often try to defend Man of Steel the same way, by saying, he's not Superman yet, or he's too inexperienced. But see, I'm arguing against the nature of his mistakes, because in Man of Steel, Superman does things that no version of Superman would ever do. I'm saying that there was no way that Man of Steel's Clark could ever become Superman, because they are two fundamentally different people. It's kind of like Smallville. They hooked people in by teasing Clark becoming Superman one day, but the longer the series went on, things just kept getting more and more convoluted and nonsensical. It was just an obvious gimmick designed to make people watch a teenage melodrama with bad writing. The characterization was such that, eventually, they could have turned even an 80-year-old Chinese woman with Alzheimer's into Superman. It would have made just as much sense, after all the mental gymnastics they did to justify Clark putting on the suit in the finale. Ugh, I really hate that show. Anyway, Man of Steel Superman often feels unheroic because of this obvious lack of insight into his character. I think this is best represented by how critics often complain that Superman never saves anybody in this movie. The thing is though, Superman saves lots of people in Man of Steel. That's not the problem. By thinking that though, you are catching on to the real problem, one of framing. See, most of the saves Superman does in this movie are done so quickly right in the middle of something else going on, that they're not only hard to notice, they're also really hard to remember afterwards. For example, I only remembered this clip after the second time watching the movie, and I'm still not convinced it was on purpose. This scene is very shortly after Clark viciously attacked Zod, punching him in the face and screaming something about his mother. I don't know. The way this is shot, how Superman just kind of zooms in from the side, it seems like he's attacking Faora the same way. Doesn't really seem like he's concerned with the pilot here at all. The essence of this problem is that we don't get any of these more intimate saves like the oil rig or the school bus later on, after Clark puts on the Superman suit. Every time we see Superman, he's just screaming and punching things. That's what people remember. The result is that young Clark early in, and Superman later on, unintentionally feel like two completely different people. Clark gets all of these intimate saves, and Superman just gets screen time punching and screaming. But Clark Kent isn't a superhero. He's not the symbol. Superman is. Superman has to intimately save people to become that symbol. That's how this works. In other words, these rare intimate scenes are the exception, not the rule. They're the only times we don't feel like ants to this guy. How'd Earth 1 handle all this? Well, Earth 1 actually received some criticism for portraying Clark as what some people described as emo. Man of Steel kinda tries to emulate that. Some people tried to make the same argument about the tone that I did with Man of Steel, but I think there's a key difference here. See, Earth 1 shows us from the beginning all the way through to the end, in the suit or out, that Clark is still a consistently kind, accepting, and thoughtful person. It's his confidence and sureness in himself that develops over time, which makes him more optimistic and more like the Superman you'd expect. That's legitimate character development, and it's also what Man of Steel misses so badly. Ultimately, the biggest failure of this movie is in its characterization of Clark and Superman, but it also has this problem with most of its other characters, especially when it comes to father figures. I've always hated the argument that humanity isn't ready for the reality of alien life. Call me optimistic, but you know what I think would happen if people found out an alien was walking around on Earth? I think they'd say, "Neat, does he look weird?" And then it'd be in the news for a while, but almost immediately everyone would go back to doing whatever their usual routine is. I mean, Superman doesn't affect your job, Superman doesn't affect your taxes, he doesn't affect having to take your kids to school, or your ability to make friends, have relationships, or go to birthday parties. Maybe a few unstable people would act out, but I'm pretty sure that 90% of the rest of the world would go on living completely normal lives, totally unaffected by it. This brings us to Man of Steel's version of Jonathan Kent, and one of the most notorious scenes in this movie. A lot of people have already spoken out about this, so I'm going to try to boil it down as much as I possibly can. Here's how it normally works. Jonathan Kent usually encourages Clark to use his gifts to help mankind, as much as he can. He thinks that the good Clark could do saving people outweighs any personal risk, but only because John already knows Clark is a good guy. He knows this because he raised him and he's lived with him his entire life. He knows that Clark is worthy of being a spiritual leader because he's seen him grow into that spiritual leader. Even as a modernization, Earth 1 still uses this same approach. Martha Kent tells us that Jonathan had wanted Clark at a pretty young age, probably younger than 20 at least, to don the cape and reveal himself to the world. Jonathan died before he got to see Clark become Superman, but he had hope in his heart that one day he would go out there and inspire people. Clark was hesitant in becoming a superhero because he was still trying to figure out who he was and where he fits into humanity. This puts the burden of choice on Clark while having Jonathan Kent as his moral compass. Even though Clark would rather spend his time making money providing for his loving mother, he becomes Superman because he knows it's the right thing to do. It's clearly characterized that he makes a choice when he does this. Jor-El, on the other hand, usually has a sort of Star Trek-like prime directive of non-interference. He doesn't know if humanity's ready for the likes of a Kryptonian, which makes a lot of sense because he's never met a human, and he has no idea what they're likely to do or capable of doing. He doesn't believe in us the way Jonathan Kent does because he's an alien who doesn't know us. And because Clark's never actually met his biological parents, he doesn't really know if they have humanity's best interests at heart either. So, because of that, he gets his morality, humanity, and thoughtfulness largely from the humans who raised him, Jonathan and Martha Kent. But Clark also has the advanced biology and progressive traits of a society hundreds of thousands of years more advanced than humanity. It means he's a strong balance of nature and nurture, and that all makes perfect sense. So, what Man of Steel does so wrong is simply that it switches the motivations between those two fathers. In Man of Steel, Jonathan Kent wants to protect Clark from mankind, and mankind from themselves, or rather from the horror that he thinks will ensue if they ever find out about him. So, if you really listen to what Jonathan is saying here, you'll notice he's not putting the burden of choice on Clark to save us. He's saying humanity isn't ready for something like Clark, but that one day, if they ever are, Clark should reveal himself and live among them. This is important. It doesn't seem like much, but this is the key difference that betrays the character. Instead of putting the burden of choice on Clark, he's putting the burden of deserving to be saved on humanity. He's saying that humanity isn't worthy of what Superman would have to offer them, that they can't handle it, so he should just take a back seat until they evolve a little. Now, I want you to imagine if your father said that to you when you told him you wanted to become a paramedic. The problem with this is immediately obvious to anyone who has any concept of morality. The choice of doing good has to be a burden on Clark. That's what superheroes are. Clark should be out there saving people, helping the helpless, giving hope to the hopeless, and strength to the weak, leading by example, making the world a better place until humanity lives up to his example, just like real-world heroes. That's the way it's worked in the comics for the last 75 years. It's, hopeful. A Superman movie should shake people out of apathy, but Jonathan Kent, he's just being paranoid, selfish, and unethical. That's why people reacted so negatively. So how does this motivation swap affect Jor-El? Well, it makes him completely irrational. Here's the thing. Jor-El has no idea what kind of man Clark has become. He's never met him before. He also doesn't know anything about humanity, how we work, what our society is like, or how we'll react. So, what if Clark had been abused by humans, locked away his whole life, and started attacking people out of spite? Would he still be worthy of being humanity's savior? You don't know, you're a computer program, you've never even met him before. What if Clark had landed in Soviet Russia and was raised by a government agent to be used as a superweapon against the rest of the world? Is the movie trying to say that Jor-El just knows Clark will be good because it's his destiny? Because he's his son and he just magically knows somehow? This is such lazy writing, and it's absolutely inferior to the source material in every way. It creates a problem for Clark's character too. So his Earth father dies trying to keep his secret, so Clark obeys him and hides himself away for the most part. But once they meet, Clark just immediately accepts everything Jor-El says at face value, without any kind of evidence whatsoever. Volume 3 of Earth 1 kind of raises this question: what if Zod had come down and pretended to be Clark's father? Would Clark have accepted him at his word just as easily? Zod pretends to be Clark's uncle instead of his father, but the concept is the same. Straczynski was pointing out how stupid this whole situation is. Not only are they irrational, but it's also a complete 180 in both of their moralities. Remember all that talk earlier about choosing your own path in life? The stuff about not doing what you're told or what society has in store for you? Even though all of that was already in the movie, having never met Clark before, having no idea what kind of man he is, or what he's been through, or what his choices are, like maybe being a doctor or advancing scientific research, Jor-El ignores all of that and says, "This is why I sent you here. This is your destiny. It's your destiny to save mankind from themselves." There was no trace of any of that before. That's not at all what these early scenes were about. I think this hologram has gone a little bit buggy. It's a completely different person than Jor-El was on Krypton. And Clark embraces this Messiah complex completely just because he tells him to. Basically, Jor-El is God and Clark is Jesus. What God says is inherently right, and Jesus is automatically good because he's God's son. I think this movie is confusing hope with blind faith. Putting all of this together, it seems like the movie implies that dogma, as in doing what you're told, is inherently better than thinking, asking questions, and benefiting society because you chose to. Clark just does what he's told, first with John when he tells him not to reveal himself, and then with Jor-El when he does tell him to reveal himself. That's not the thoughtful humanistic morality Superman is known for. Morality means making a choice. Superman is about choices. Heroes make choices. The only way Jor-El should be hopeful is by saying, "I hope you grow up strong and live a good life, my son." Pa Kent should be hopeful by saying, "I hope you grow into the great man that I see in you. I hope you really can live up to the role of a spiritual leader." And when that kind of talk comes from Jonathan Kent, it's because he knows Clark. He knows he's worthy of that role. It's got nothing to do with destiny. Jonathan has an optimistic attitude about the inherent goodness in people because he's seen it firsthand. He encourages giving the benefit of the doubt, not making blind assumptions. But when this same savior talk comes from Jor-El, it's completely irrational and really creepy when you start to think about it. He's an alien from another planet, one who's never even met a single human being, and suddenly he's decided that we are inherently inferior to him. So he sends us his son to create a new perfect society on Earth, whether we want him to or not. This is where the movie stops being just a bad Superman movie and becomes really, really offensive.